Hello, everybody, and thank you for stopping by. Today, I want to talk about canning on a wood stove. Now, what you're looking at isn't a wood stove, it's a wood heater, although many times that's what I call it, a wood stove. But a wood stove is different, it has an oven to it, whereas a wood heater, it doesn't. But I do have two plates on the top. Now, there are some wood heaters that I've seen that have four, but I don't think they're really that big, and the plates are kind of small. But, you can still cook on it. And I cook on this a lot in the wintertime. But I want to talk about the canning on it. Now, I can only tell you from my own personal experience and from other people who have actually had wood stoves, which was my grandmother. My grandmother never pressure canned on her wood stove. She water bath canned everything, including sausage. They would grind up sausage and can it. They did salt cure some meats, but she canned a lot of meat, and she water bath canned a lot of vegetables, including green beans. Well, I asked her about this because as I got older, I knew that canning, the safest way they claimed for low acid foods and meats, was pressure canning. Now, my grandmother had two wood stoves. She had one in the house, and then she had one on the outside that she had it covered with, three sides. She left the front open for air because she used that to cook on in the summertime because she did not want to heat her house up. She said a wood stove in the house, using it in the summertime, is absolutely unbearable. She said you cannot stay in the house. So she cooked on the outside. She usually cooked early in the morning. Now back then, in my grandmother's day, and she lived through the Depression, they had no refrigerators and no freezers. So, and it wasn't because, they couldn't afford it, they just didn't exist yet. And as a matter of fact, gas stoves didn't exist either. And so she, like I said, she water bath canned everything. And she continued to do that even when the invention of the gas stove came out and everything. She just continued to do it the way she used to do it. And I questioned her about that. I said, Grandma, they say pressure canning is the safest way to do things. And it has to do with botulism. And my grandmother said, if you're cleaning your home and you understand what botulism comes from, home canning and water bath is not a big deal. That was her philosophy, but it's not mine, okay? I'm more inclined to believe that you have to pressure can. I'd rather be safe than sorry. But I will say nobody in her family ever died or even got sick from her water bath canning. But I will say my grandmother was extremely clean. She really was, to a fault sometimes. She drove some of us nuts. But with that aside, I will tell you my personal experience when it comes to pressure canning on a wood stove, or which this is the same, what you're looking at, as a wood stove, except it doesn't have the oven to it. I warped my first canner that I bought on it, and I called the company where I got it from and told them that my canner was warped. And the woman said to me, "It's warped?" And I said, "Yes," and I just used it. And she goes, "What did you use it on?" And I said, "A wood stove." And she said, "Sorry, but we don't guarantee our our pressure canners from warping when you use them on something that they do not recommend or consider the proper way to use your canner." Now you got to remember, the more inexpensive canners, now there's some canners out there over $200. I didn't try one of those. I will be honest, I didn't try it. Okay? I'm not paying that for a canner. I'm not rich. But anyhow, they said they're aluminum and you cannot use them on wood stoves. And so I lost my money on my first canner. Said I wouldn't do that again. Now the problem that you also have, and this is something my grandmother said, is it's extremely, extremely difficult. My grandmother said it's impossible. She said that anybody back in her day that actually used the pressure canners could never get them to the gauge they were supposed to be. In other words, if you went to pressure can at 10 pounds of pressure or 15 pounds of pressure, she said nobody that she knew that had bought them could even get it to do that on a wood stove. They would not hold their pressure because of the fluctuation of the stove itself, being its wood. And she said, quite honestly, most people back then water bath can, but she said you always had a few neighbors maybe that had a little bit more money, and they always would buy the latest and newest thing that came out. And since everybody was talking that this was the safest and you should not water bath can anymore, she did know somebody that bought one. And the woman was angry over it and said they're useless, especially on a wood stove. And since there was no gas stoves back then, she didn't see the point of even doing this. And basically, she quit doing it herself because she could never get it to the level that it's supposed to be. It either went really high or it would drop down really low. And the frustration of it, and you got to remember that the people back then knew how to cook with wood stoves. If anybody was a professional at it, they were, because they baked breads, they made cakes, they made biscuits, all in their wood stove. So they knew how to regulate temperatures in their stove to cook things with. But my grandmother had said that anybody back then that she knew that had a pressure canner could not get it to regulate. Now, I don't know. I will say this. Because I know a lot of people think they're going to pressure can when everything falls apart. And I say to myself, if everything falls apart, you are probably not going to have the gas. And if you do, you are not going to want to waste it on canning. And then what? Have nothing to cook with? And so if things fall apart like some people think, there will be no gas. And so you wouldn't be able to can anyhow, so you would have to do it on a wood stove. Well, all I can say is if you're one of those that are insistent, try it before everything falls apart. Because the last thing you want to find out is it cannot be done when everything falls apart. Because like I said, or I should say like my grandmother said, you have to stop and think. Most of your produce comes, your garden, your vegetables, come in the summertime. Most of us do not have a house that is, good enough that heat just leaks out of it everywhere. So you're going to can it in your house in the summertime? I don't think so. So to me, logically speaking, that doesn't make sense that you think you're going to can tomatoes, green beans, and all this stuff when everything falls apart, because all those things come in the summertime. Now, you normally kill things in the wintertime, meat, because, you don't want to kill it in the heat, you want to kill it when the weather is much cooler. So then maybe possibly you might be able to can some of your meat, if you can figure out what you're doing. Okay, so my advice would be if that's what you're going to try to do not go with the aluminum cheaper type pressure canners, because they do work. I know that personally. Personally, it happened to me. I also know a woman who said she bought a brand new electric stove, and it was one of those flat surface ones. She couldn't can on it. She said she could never get it up to pressure to what it was supposed to be, and it had to do with her stove. And she was very upset over it when she found out she was no longer able to can on that stove. So practice first. I don't see how you're going to do it in the summertime. Unless you are the kind of person that has lots of money for a wood stove. And like I said, if things get that bad, you must take into consideration, where are you going to get enough wood to do all this? Because if things get as bad as some people out there are talking about, wood and getting wood is going to be a very serious issue. And I doubt that you would be able to get enough wood to cook on, because even if you didn't have a wood stove and there was no gas, you're going to have to cook on something. So even if it's a rocket stove or something you've made outside to cook on, it is going to require wood. So I don't see this as feasible. That's just me personally. But I'm giving you the information because the worst time to find out that something can't be done is when you're right in the middle of it. It's best to practice things first, you know. It just is. It's like I've heard a lot of people talk about making bread from beans and all kinds of things. Well, I've done a whole lot of research on it. They don't make very good bread at all. There's only been one or two people out there that have had any success with making sort of a halfway decent loaf, and it wasn't that great, and it wasn't made with beans that most of us think of that we can use. So if you're one of those that thinks you're going to grind your beans down into flour, I want to tell you something. I've used a hand grinder. It is one of the worst, most horrible things to try to use. It takes you forever, and you get very little flour out of that hand grinder. You just do. Now, if things are that bad, and there's electricity, you might be able to use an electric grinder. But people supposedly are doing all this because they think everything's going to fall apart. And so they're saving all these things because they think they're going to be able to grind down their wheat berries and all kinds of things. Now, granted, some of them may think, well, you know, food shortages are going to be so bad and they're going to be so expensive. But I'm going to be honest, there's some things that we're just going to have to learn to live without. And bread may be one of them. Now, my grandmother lived through the Depression and she never lived without bread. They had biscuits all the time and they always had cornbread. Now, my grandmother grew sugar cane and she did not grind her own flour and she did not grind her own cornmeal. That was something that she purchased, but she was able to purchase that because she had so much of everything else she needed. She had her meats, she had her vegetables, so it wasn't such a big deal. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was very difficult on her, and money was very tight, but she did and was able to come up with money for the basic of flour and cornmeal. So, like I said, practice first. Make sure first. I've had no luck with grinding down anything and making a decent loaf of bread at all because most of them call for you to mix the bean or wheat, just like I have mesquite seeds, you know, and mesquite flour. Well, I've not found a recipe on how to make anything with 100% mesquite. And I have tried using the mesquite, and it's not a good product, you know. So, like I said, please, don't wait till you're in the situation and don't wait till things fall apart. To try to practice with something, be doing it now. Because you don't want to find out in the end that you were banking on this to work and it didn't. Okay, so I hope you found this informative and may you have a very blessed day. And I would like to add just one more thing. I want you to know that if any of you out there that have a wood heater already know this. The heat that comes off a wood heater is completely different than the heat on your stove. Many of us even now, even though we have gas stoves or electric stoves, we find it very hard in the summertime to cook. Well, stoves in general, the wood type, are made from cast iron. And they hold the heat for a very long time. And the heat on them gets much higher than what your stove in your kitchen does. And that's why it becomes so hard to cook on a wood stove in the summertime. I would never fire this up in the summer to cook on. It would be unbearable. I mean, absolutely unbearable. Because I have gotten up some days and it would be a very chilly morning and I would put wood in that, and by midday I had to open every door and window because the temperature went up to 70 or 80 degrees during the day and I couldn't stay in the house. It was so hot. So think about that. The heat that comes off of that is far different. Now, there may be somebody else or some people out there that have built a house and, you know, they may be using this and somehow they've got their house, they've made it so that it ventilates. I don't know. But I know personally most of us don't have homes like that. Most of us have not been able to build these really fancy homes that will pull that heat out while you can and do everything on it. So I just wanted to add that. This is truly a different type of heat compared to your stove. No, but like I said, there may be some out there that can. But you have to think of the expense and where you live and what kind of house you live in. The average house that we have built for us today, or that we live in, is not built to run that in the summertime, okay?